April 1945. A makeshift processing center outside Nuremberg. The air smells of diesel exhaust and damp canvas. A column of captured German women stands in loose formation, uniforms dusty, faces blank with exhaustion. They are Luftwaffenhelfen, auxiliaries who operated flak batteries and communication stations. As the Reich crumbled around them, an American MP approaches the entrance to a supply tent. He pauses, steps aside, and gestures inward. "Ladies first," he says in accented German. The women don't move. They glance at each other. One furrows her brow. Another shifts her weight, uncertain. The phrase registers, but its meaning doesn't. The guard repeats himself, thinking they didn't hear. Still, they hesitate. For 12 years, they had been told what Americans were: decadent, brutal, racially poisoned. Now, standing before them, an enemy soldier had just used a word they understood individually, but not together. Ladies. They had been soldiers, tools, useful components of the war machine. But never, not once in their training, in their service, in their indoctrination, had they been called that. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense, but they had been closer to the war than most civilians ever came. The Helferinnen, female auxiliaries of the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe, numbered over 500,000. By 1945, they operated switchboards in bunkers beneath Berlin. They plotted aircraft movements on maps in command centers. They loaded ammunition into anti-aircraft guns as Allied bombers darkened the skies. Some served in clerical roles, typing orders that sent men to the front. Others worked in field hospitals, holding down soldiers as limbs were amputated without anesthesia. The Nazi state had mobilized them out of necessity, not ideology. Hitler's rhetoric about women belonging in the home had collided with the reality of total war. By 1943, Germany was hemorrhaging men faster than it could replace them. The solution was pragmatic: pull women into roles that freed men for combat. They were given uniforms, ranks, and duties, but they were never given equality. Their training was rigid, functional, and laced with indoctrination. They learned Morse code and how to operate radio equipment. They memorized aircraft silhouettes and studied firing tables for flak guns. But woven into every lesson was the ideology: sacrifice for the Führer, loyalty to the folk, the existential struggle against Bolshevism and Anglo-American plutocracy. They were taught that the enemy did not see them as women. The Soviets would ravage them. The Americans would exploit them. Mercy was not something to expect. Chivalry, as the Western world understood it, had no place in their framework. The Nazi ideal of womanhood was maternal and subordinate, but in wartime service, it became mechanical. They were Magdal, girls, a term that stripped away adulthood and individuality. They existed to serve, not to be served. Doors were not held open. Seats were not offered. Courtesy was inefficiency. By early 1945, the war had come home to Germany. The Rhine had been crossed. The Ruhr was encircled. Soviet forces were carving through East Prussia, while American and British units pushed deeper into the heartland. As Wehrmacht units disintegrated, thousands of Helferinnen found themselves trapped in the chaos. Some fled west, hoping to avoid Soviet capture. Others remained at their posts until Allied forces arrived, uncertain whether surrender meant survival or something worse. The Americans had not anticipated capturing so many women. The Wehrmacht auxiliaries were combatants under international law. They wore uniforms, held ranks, and performed military functions. But the Geneva Convention's provisions had been written with male soldiers in mind. Field commanders improvised. Separate compounds were established. Female guards were requisitioned when available. Medical examinations were conducted with translators present. The U.S. Army, for all its logistical prowess, was suddenly administering camps for an enemy it hadn't fully planned for. What the German women encountered defied their expectations. They were housed separately from male POWs. They received the same rations as American servicewomen, not the reduced allotments given to male prisoners. They were allowed to keep personal items. Medical care was provided without interrogation or coercion. Guards maintained distance and protocol. The treatment was not warm, but it was correct, procedurally, bureaucratically, almost impersonally fair. This civility was doctrine, not sentiment. The US military operated under strict guidelines regarding prisoners of war. Violations were investigated, punishments were real, and the chain of command reinforced compliance. American soldiers had been trained to distinguish between the enemy's military and its humanity. That distinction had been absent from German training. The Wehrmacht and SS had operated under Kommissar Baffel and other directives that classified entire categories of people as subhuman. The contrast was not subtle. The phrase "ladies first" was not policy. It was reflex, a cultural artifact carried across the Atlantic by men raised in a society where such gestures were routine. For the guards, it meant nothing profound. For the prisoners, it meant everything. It was the first crack in a worldview that had been welded shut. Angle 1. The ideological lens for years. They had been fed a narrative. The Americans were weak, corrupted by jazz and liberalism and racial mixing. Their soldiers were cowards who relied on material superiority rather than spirit. They had no discipline, no honor, no understanding of sacrifice. This was the message in newsreels, in training lectures, in whispered conversations among officers. The propaganda was relentless and specific. American men were degenerate, their women promiscuous, their society crumbling under the weight of its own decadence. When captured, they held for an unexpected confirmation of what they'd been told. They anticipated brutality masked as democracy, exploitation dressed up as liberation. The stories from the Eastern Front were horrific. Soviet soldiers committing atrocities that no propaganda had to exaggerate. The assumption was that the Americans would be different only in method, not in intent. Perhaps more calculated, perhaps more coldly efficient, but still fundamentally hostile to everything they represented. Instead, they found bureaucracy, paperwork, medical checks conducted by female staff when possible, questions asked through interpreters, not under duress. They were given soap, towels, access to latrines with privacy. These were not grand gestures. They were mundane courtesies, and that ordinariness was what made them incomprehensible. The propaganda had prepared them for monsters or saviors. It had not prepared them for indifference tempered by procedure. Angle 2. The military realiteth divide between East and West was not theoretical for these women. Many had served near the collapsing Eastern Front. They had heard the accounts, sometimes first-hand, sometimes through the rumor networks that spread faster than official orders. Soviet forces, driven by rage at what the Wehrmacht had done on their soil, showed little mercy. German women captured in the East faced violence, forced labor, and deportation to camps where survival was uncertain. The Red Army's advance was accompanied by vengeance that erased distinctions between combatant and civilian, guilty and complicit. Those who surrendered to American or British forces encountered a different war, not gentler in its firepower. Allied bombing had leveled cities and killed tens of thousands, but governed by different rules once the shooting stopped. Western POW camps were regimented, often overcrowded, sometimes grim, but they operated within a legal framework that recognized prisoners as human beings temporarily removed from combat, not as enemies to be erased. Food was insufficient but distributed. Shelter was inadequate but provided. Medical care was stretched thin but available. Angle 3. The gestures meaning within Nazi military culture. The concept of chivalry had been systematically dismantled. The regime viewed traditional manners as bourgeois affectation, relics of a weaker age. Women in service were not to be coddled. They were components of the war machine, differentiated from men only by physical limitation and reproductive function. Deference was weakness. Courtesy was wasted energy. Every interaction was transactional, hierarchical, calibrated to maximize efficiency and reinforce the chain of command. Ladies first contained assumptions that did not exist in that system. It presumed that gender superseded rank in certain contexts. It implied that women deserved consideration simply for being women, independent of utility or status. It suggested that even in a military environment, certain civilian norms could persist. To a Helferin who had spent years being addressed by rank or function, never by courtesy title, the phrase was linguistically clear, but contextually alien. Some thought it was mockery. Others suspected manipulation, a trick to lower their guard before interrogation or worse. A few recognized it as genuine, but couldn't reconcile that recognition with everything they'd been taught about the enemy. The cognitive dissonance was acute. If the Americans were capable of this small kindness, what else had been a lie? And if the propaganda about the enemy was false, what did that suggest about the propaganda they'd been fed about everything else? Angle 4. The Guards' perspective. If American soldiers faced their own confusion, they had been trained to fight the Wehrmacht, to destroy the Nazi war machine, to liberate Europe from fascism. They had not been trained to process young women in Luftwaffe uniforms who looked exhausted and frightened and not particularly fanatical. The propaganda back home had focused on jackbooted stormtroopers and SS thugs, not 20-year-old radio operators who'd been conscripted into service. Many of the Guards were teenagers themselves, farm boys from Iowa or factory workers from Detroit, raised in homes where you opened doors for women and stood when they entered a room. Those reflexes didn't shut off because the women in question had been enemies hours earlier. The gestures were automatic, almost unconscious, but they created friction with military protocol. How do you maintain authority while offering courtesy? How do you guard someone you've been conditioned to protect? Some officers worried about fraternization, about sympathy undermining discipline. Others recognized that basic decency served strategic purposes. Cooperative prisoners were easier to manage, and word of fair treatment spread quickly through the POW networks. But most guards weren't thinking strategically. They were just doing what they'd been taught, applying peacetime manners to a wartime situation, and watching their captives react with suspicion to gestures that felt, to the Americans, like simple common sense. The processing took hours, names recorded, ranks verified, personal effects catalogued and stored. The women moved through stations in the compound, each one reinforcing the strangeness of their situation. At one table, a sergeant asked about medical conditions, noting allergies and injuries on a form. At another, a nurse checked for lice and contagious diseases, explaining each step through an interpreter. No one shouted. No one struck them. The violence they had braced for never materialized. In the barracks, they found bunks with thin mattresses and wool blankets. Not comfortable, but better than the cellars and foxholes many had sheltered in during the final chaotic weeks. The latrines had doors. The wash area had running water, cold but functional. A guard delivered a box of Red Cross supplies, tinned meat, crackers, powdered milk, cigarettes. He set it down, nodded, and left without taking anything, without demanding anything. One woman stared at the box for a full minute before opening it, convinced there had to be a trap. The first meal was served in a mess tent. The women lined up, received trays, and sat at long tables. The food was bland, boiled potatoes, some kind of meat stew, bread, but there was enough of it. No one went hungry. An American cook, an older man with a weary face, ladled portions without comment. When one woman's tray tipped and spilled, he simply refilled it, waving off her stammered apology. It was such a small thing, it should not have mattered. But she sat down shaking. That night, in whispered conversations after lights out, they tried to make sense of it. Some insisted it was temporary, that the real treatment would begin once they were transported to permanent camps. Others argued it was propaganda, that they were being kept comfortable so photographs could be taken, proof of American mercy for the newsreels. A few said nothing, too exhausted or too disoriented to form theories, but all of them felt the dissonance. The Americans were not behaving like victors. They were behaving like administrators. Days passed. The routine solidified. Morning roll call, work assignments, cleaning, laundry, kitchen duty, supervised, but not brutal. Afternoon recreation time in a fenced yard, evening meals, male privileges. though letters were censored. Access to a camp library with German books. The structure was military, but the texture was different from anything they had known. Orders were given without screaming. Mistakes were corrected without punishment. The absence of cruelty was itself disorienting. The turning point came not in a single moment, but in accumulation. A guard who learned basic German phrases to communicate more easily. A medic who sat with a woman suffering from nightmares, speaking quietly until she calmed. A commander who intervened when a new guard made a crude comment, reprimanding him publicly and reassigning him immediately. Each incident was minor. Together, they formed a pattern that could not be dismissed as coincidence or deception. One Helferin, a former communications operator named Marguerite, kept a diary that would later be preserved in archives. Her entries from late April and early May 1945 track the psychological shift. "They treat us as if we are people," she wrote on April 28. "I do not understand why." By May 5, the confusion had deepened. "Today a guard helped me carry a basket of laundry. He did not have to. No one ordered him. He simply did it." By May 12, the tone had changed. "We were told they would violate us, starve us, work us to death. None of this has happened. Were we lied to about everything?" The question spread through the barracks like a contagion. If the propaganda about American barbarism was false, what about the rest? The promises of final victory, the necessity of total war, the existential threat posed by the Allies. For 12 years, they had lived inside a closed information system. Every news source, every authority figure, every cultural reference point had reinforced the same narrative. Now, confronted with evidence that contradicted the core claims, the entire structure began to crack. Some resisted. Ideology is not abandoned easily, especially when it has shaped identity and justified sacrifice. A few insisted that their captors were anomalies, that other camps were surely different, that the true face of American occupation would reveal itself eventually. But even the resistors couldn't ignore the daily evidence. The Red Cross inspections that were allowed without interference, the Protestant chaplain who offered services for those who wanted them, the commander who posted the Geneva Convention regulations in German on the barracks wall and told them to report any violations. By summer, as Germany's unconditional surrender became undeniable fact, the psychological reckoning intensified. They had lost the war, that much was obvious, but they were also losing something deeper, the certainty that they had been on the right side, that their service had been noble, that the enemy had been everything they'd been told. The small courtesies, the procedural fairness, the absence of revenge, these things were more destabilizing than cruelty would have been. Cruelty could be understood. It fit the narrative. Kindness required a complete recalibration of reality. One woman later recalled the moment she truly understood. A guard had opened a gate for her, stepping aside with that same gesture, ladies first. This time, she didn't hesitate. She walked through, and as she did, she realized she had just accepted a premise that contradicted everything she'd been taught about herself, about the enemy, about the war. She was not a tool. She was a person, and the Americans, impossibly, had known that all along. By the end of 1945, approximately 400,000 German POWs remained in American custody on European soil, including several thousand female auxiliaries. The women were held separately in designated camps, primarily in Bavaria and the Rhineland. Repatriation began in stages, prioritized by age, health, and regional origin. The process was bureaucratic and slow, tangled in the chaos of post-war Europe, where borders had shifted and entire populations had been displaced. Most Helferinnen were released by mid-1946. They returned to a Germany that no longer existed in the form they had known. Cities were rubble. Families were scattered or dead. The Reich had been partitioned into occupation zones. The economy had collapsed into barter and black markets. Food was scarce. Housing was scarcer. Millions of refugees from the east poured westward, fleeing Soviet occupation. The women came home to find that home was an abstraction. Many never spoke about their captivity. In the immediate post-war years, survival took precedence over reflection. There were ration cards to obtain, relatives to locate, jobs to find in a gutted economy. The collective silence about the Nazi years descended quickly, driven partly by shame, partly by psychological necessity, partly by the occupying powers' focus on denazification and reconstruction rather than individual reckoning. What happened in the POW camps became private memory, rarely shared even with family. The contrast between Western and Eastern captivity became starker with time. German women captured by Soviet forces faced years of forced labor in camps across the USSR. Tens of thousands were sent to mines, factories, and construction projects in conditions that killed many and broke most of the survivors. Repatriation from Soviet custody dragged on until the mid-1950s. Those who returned carried physical and psychological scars that Western-held prisoners largely escaped. This disparity shaped German memory of the war's end. In what would become West Germany, American and British occupation was remembered as strict but ultimately tolerable. The Marshall Plan brought reconstruction aid. Democracy was imposed but took root. Former enemies became allies. The women who had been held in Western camps could acknowledge, at least privately, that they had been fortunate in their captors. Those who had experienced Soviet imprisonment rarely spoke at all. Historical documentation came decades later. In the 1980s and 1990s, as Germany confronted its past more directly, oral history projects began collecting testimonies from former Helferinnen. The interviews revealed patterns, the initial fear, the confusion at humane treatment, the slow psychological adjustment, the realization that propaganda had been lies. Some women expressed gratitude, others remained conflicted, unable to reconcile their fair treatment with the destruction Allied bombing had inflicted on German cities. A few still clung to fragments of Nazi ideology, the cognitive dissonance never fully resolved. The numbers tell part of the story. Of the German women held by US forces, mortality rates were negligible. Disease outbreaks were contained. Documented abuse cases were rare and prosecuted when they occurred. This was not mercy in any emotional sense. It was adherence to international law and military discipline. But to the women who experienced it, the distinction between policy and compassion was often impossible to draw. They had expected the worst. They received the minimum standards of civilized warfare. The gap between expectation and reality changed them in ways that decades could not erase. The phrase "ladies first" became a metonym in some testimonies, shorthand for the entire disorienting experience of being treated as human by an enemy. They'd been conditioned to fear and hate. It represented the collision of two worldviews, the moment when ideology met reality and reality won. For some, it was the beginning of deprogramming. For others, it was simply a strange memory from a strange time, but none of them forgot it. Wars are decided by firepower and strategy, by resources and will, but they are remembered in smaller moments. A door held open, a phrase spoken without thought, a gesture so ordinary it should have meant nothing. For the German women who heard "ladies first" in the spring of 1945, that moment contained an entire education. It taught them that the enemy was not what they'd been told, that propaganda could be comprehensive and still be lies, that human decency could persist even in the machinery of war. It taught them, most unsettlingly, that they had served a cause built on falsehoods so complete that even basic courtesy from the other side felt like a contradiction. History is often written in grand narratives, battles won, nations fallen, ideologies defeated. But it is also written in the quiet ruptures of individual consciousness, in the seconds of confusion when a soldier steps aside and waits, in the realization that follows, slow and irreversible, that the world is not what you were taught it was. The war ended, the camps emptied, the women went home to a shattered country and tried to build lives from the rubble. But some part of them remained in that moment of hesitation, standing at a tent entrance, hearing to words that should have been simple and discovering they had forgotten what simple meant. They had been told they were tools, An enemy guard had called them ladies, and in that small, unbridgeable gap lay the difference between the world they had fought for and the one they would have to live in now.